Many of the most successful 19th century newspapers and periodicals had the ability to be more than what they intended. This was especially true for titles published beyond London and those originating from Scotland and Ireland. The most successful titles, such as the Edinburgh Review, transcended borders and developed a model that changed the game for the British publishing industry. The Edinburgh Review stands as one of Scotland's most important publications historically, developing at the end of the Scottish Enlightenment as the 18th century faded into the 19th century. The review set the standard for all reviews which followed. It lasted for 127 years and attracted some of the most prominent writers of the century. It was a prominent Whig publication that endured many political changes and ended with a bitter political declaration. The Edinburgh began on 10 October 1802. When it was first issued, it reflected the high-thinking principles of the Scottish Enlightenment. It was a quintessential Enlightenment publication insofar as it distilled the best of what had been thought, said, and written, and it filtered this to the public. It extended knowledge and debate through its own commentary. It was liberal by nature, and it really helped to push knowledge forward in Scotland and worldwide. Francis Jeffrey was its inaugural editor, although Sidney Smith edited the first 3 numbers until a more permanent editor could be found. Jeffrey set the tone for the publication, and he was often soliciting advice and modifying the operation to improve the quality. His tenure lasted for 26 years, 98 numbers, with the paper averaging a circulation of 10 to 12,000. Jeffrey guided the contributors and wrote reviews himself, becoming a preeminent Scottish critic. The praise is even confirmed by many contemporary and modern critics. When the first number was issued, Lord Cockburn called it electric. 21st century scholar Bill Bell asserts that the golden age of Scottish periodicals began with the Edinburgh Review, which set the standard for literary criticism. The publication, quote, took the literary world by storm, soon enjoying notoriety throughout Britain and overseas, end quote. A few key relationships were central to developing this notoriety. Publishers Archibald Constable in Edinburgh and T.N. Longman and its derivatives in London partnered to make the Edinburgh available to the London market. Alloway explains that John Murray II, the London book agent, was also a crucial figure because he increased competition in the London market. This pushed Longman to work harder and ensure that the publication reached as many booksellers as possible. The competition was so fierce, says Alloway, that Longman approached Francis Jeffrey about creating another publication. Although the attempt was unsuccessful, there is no better testament of the Edinburgh's success than the fact that the publishers and book agents were fighting for a space in one of the world's most prominent markets. The Edinburgh Review did not impose any limits on its contributors, and this was central to its early success. Although there was a unified tone or aura to the publication, the initial management, particularly Jeffrey, allowed the contributors the space to integrate their own voice into the publication. The review enlisted primarily gentlemen as writers, and as Faustus explains, it encouraged them to develop their own voice on the subject rather than being bound simply to the text that they were reviewing. This strategy rendered their criticism more authentic and poignant, allowing subjectivity to create dialogue between the text, the publication, and the authors themselves. Spurgeon also notes this freedom of speech approach as integral to the publication's early days, because it allowed them to develop their own style and present authentic views. When the publication began paying its contributors, which Finkelstein explains was suggested by Sidney Smith, it began attracting more high-profile names. Giving prominent writers the freedom to apply their own voice and flavor to the publication made the Edinburgh a prominent Scottish literary organ. It was a critical centerpiece to the Scottish society, providing nuanced reviews and appealing to the middle class. It was an authoritative voice in not only the Scottish market but across the UK and abroad, at least for its initial years. Being free to voice opinions was not without its consequences. When Jeffrey produced a scathing review of Thomas More's Odes and Epistles, Moore retaliated and challenged Jeffrey to a duel. They met, but before they could duel, they were arrested. Moore was publicly ridiculed afterwards, but he and Jeffrey seemed to have become friends. Moore eventually contributed to the Edinburgh Review himself. The review had many other prominent contributors during its tenure. In the early days, occasional contributors included Sir Walter Scott, Henry Peter Brougham, and Thomas Robert Malthus. Later, Thomas Carlyle, Leigh Hunt, John Stuart Mill, George Henry Lewis, Matthew Arnold, Edward Bulwer Lytton, Charles Dickens, and William Makepeace Thackeray made contributions. Near the end of the century, Charles Lewis, Margaret Oliphant, and Henry Reeve contributed. Charles Dickens, an advocate for social reform himself, contributed articles to the Edinburgh Review in the 1832 reform. Dickens wrote articles to enlist government funds to school reform, but was unsuccessful in his venture. Walter Scott eventually forbid the publication from being delivered to his door, despite believing that it was the only worthwhile publication of its kind. By 1909, the Edinburgh's politics had become more extreme. It took controversial stances on political issues such as Spain, which turned numerous people, including Scott, off the publication. Eventually, the Quarterly Review was started in part as a response to this extremism. From the start, the publication was aligned with the Whigs and acted as an official opposition organ for almost 3 decades. Detractors went so far as to call it a Jacobin publication in its early days, aligning with the French Revolutionists. It was heavily invested in economics, particularly free trade, political economy, and equitable taxation. Ironically, the Whigs taking over Parliament worked against the Edinburgh Review. As Shattuck explains, after being an opposition organ for so long, the Edinburgh struggled to adapt to one of its new statuses. It transitioned from being the official opposition organ to being a party organ, which was, to quote Shattuck, quote, a relationship that was neither straightforward nor comfortable, end quote. Advocating reform was the publication's bread and butter for so long, but when reform actually happened, what was left? These struggles marked the early decline of the publication, but they certainly did not spell its end. The Edinburgh persisted as a prominent title for another 90 years. The middle years after Geoffrey saw some prominent contributors, as I have shown, and it maintained a high circulation well into the 20th century. However, interest in the publication did wane, and its final editor, Harold Cox, was forced to cease publication in October 1929. In total, the Edinburgh Review published 250 volumes, many of them containing over 500 numbers. In the final number, Cox lamented that the publication ceased because there were no more Whigs left, but this hyperbole is extreme. The Edinburgh had a good run, it achieved tremendous heights, and influenced readers for over 100 years. I don't know what more we can ask for. It was a prominent publication and is a really good study even today. Thank you for listening.